Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 31st of March, 2023, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, as usual, on Friday, Patrick Henningsen. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
And we've got Vanessa Beeley joining us from Damascus via video link, as usual. So let's get straight on then with, Joe Biden's Summit for Democracy. It's been taking place this week. So this is the Summit for Democracy, which is... it was a virtual conference, 120 countries taking part. Of course, China and Russia were not taking part because they're not considered democracies. Taiwan did take part. But the other thing that was interesting, Patrick, was that Turkey and Hungary were banned from the event as well. When they were previewing the summit on Tuesday this week, he said that the event aims to focus on themes of strengthening democracy, strengthening democratic resilience, promoting respect for human rights, and advancing the fight against corruption. Let's just have a little listen to what Joe, when he was introducing the conference with a couple of others, had to say. Just a few seconds.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second Summit for Democracy. Since our first summit, our democracies have come together to meet the needs of our people and the challenges of our time.
We are tackling the issues that matter most to people's lives, creating jobs, strengthening food and global health security, and ensuring our children have what they need to succeed.
We are making strides to avert a climate catastrophe and unlock a clean energy future that is equitable and fair.
We're holding Russia accountable for its unjust and unprovoked war against Ukraine, showing that democracies are strong and resolved.
Strong and resolved. So if everybody stopped laughing at that, what were your thoughts?
So Hungary is an EU country, isn't it, Mike?
And a NATO country.
And a NATO country, but
and Turkey's a NATO country.
But they're not democracies.
Well, whether they're democracies or not, they're not allowed to take part in the Democracy Summit.
Someone should notify Ursula von der Leyen straight away that Hungary is not a democracy. That seems like a pretty urgent matter.
Well, since we've mentioned Ursula von der Leyen, let's bring her on.
Today, we all understand that we must fight for democracy every single day. That's the nature of democracy. We can never take it for granted. We must always take care of it and renew that bond of trust between the people and the institutions that serve them.
So if they have to renew this bond of trust between the people and the institutions which she claims serve them, and instead they dictate to them, then there's an acknowledgement there that trust has been lost already. Well, the question then is, what are they doing to reestablish that trust? Are they telling the truth? Let's listen to what Rishi Sunak had to say in just a few seconds.
Since the Summit for Democracy in 2021, there have been two defining events. First, Russia has sought to obliterate democracy in Ukraine, while also accelerating their malicious disinformation campaigns around the world. Second, democracies like ours have stood up. We have worked together to protect the Ukrainian people and to defend their rights and freedoms.
Church.
So,
except for freedom of religion in Ukraine, which Zelensky's cracking down on the Russian Orthodox Church. The Patriarch spoke out about it, by the way.
Yes.
He said, whoa, you should fear. He told Zelensky you should be of fear. Anyway.
Yes. So the question is, Patrick, having watched Ursula and Rishi, are you feeling more trustful of democracies?
A lot more trustful.
A lot more trustful.
And Rishi Sunak wearing the glasses now, the spectacles, makes him, I think, a lot more authoritative. So I think this is progress.
So yesterday at the summit, the UK and the US announced the winners of their prize competition, prize challenges as they're describing it, which drives innovation and privacy enhancing technologies apparently, and two main areas. The first one on pandemic response and forecasting. So this is one area where they were giving away prizes, basically money, for dealing with what they're now describing as end-to-end privacy. So you can't call it end-to-end encryption because, of course, we're working to ban that. We're going to come on to that in a second. So they're calling it end-to-end privacy instead. And the other area that they decided they were going to have a look at was this, financial crime prevention. So these are the two areas. Here's Michelle Donnellan and what she had to say. Never before has our privacy been so important, and we must protect our democratic values by safeguarding the right to privacy. That is why the UK and its allies are collaborating to create innovative technologies that enable public institutions to combat financial crime, promote public health, without compromising the confidentiality of the sensitive data they manage. So the question is that true? What exactly, how are the UK and its allies collaborating? Let's just remind ourselves, first of all, online safety bill in the UK. If we take the UK, how does the fact that the online safety bill enables mass surveillance on a scale we've never seen before, how does that enhance our privacy? Let's just remind ourselves what Index on Censorship said about this. Provisions in the online safety bill that would enable state-backed surveillance of private communications contain some of the broadest and most powerful surveillance powers ever proposed in any Western democracy. It means that the UK would be one of the first democracies to place a de facto ban on end-to-end encryption for private messaging apps. And then they got an opinion from a King's Counsel, and the legal opinion said that Section 104 of the Online Safety Bill, Section 104 notices amount to state-mandated surveillance. Ofcom would have wider remit on mass surveillance powers of UK citizens than the UK spy agencies. Just consider that. Ofcom, the so-called regulator, would have wider remit for mass surveillance than MI5, MI6 and GCHQ. The King's Counsel's opinion was that the legality of Section 104 of the Online Safety Bill is questionable. And of course, there's a failure to protect journalists, and this was a theme of the Democracy Summit. Was that they wanted to enhance protection for journalists.
Why does Ofcom need mass surveillance capability? What would
well, because it needs mass surveillance capability. Because how else does it identify what people are doing online and identify what is an online harm, and then take action against the platforms that aren't enforcing the legislation?
So to watch what people are looking at. Right.
But also what people are posting.
It's very much like Big Brother, isn't it?
Very much like that. Okay, doesn't end there, because remember, we're collaborating with other countries. So let's look at what the United States are doing. Two pieces of legislation that have been proposed in the last few weeks. The first one is this. It's the Data Act. This is being put forward by Republican Representative Michael McCall, who's Republican from Texas. And DATA stands for Deterring America's Technological Adversaries. Now, this is one of the two acts which is being presented as going against TikTok. The whole TikTok thing is a distraction. When we actually look under the surface of this and look into the weeds, this legislation is pretty grim. So this is one. Now, this doesn't have cross-party support and it doesn't have White House support. But if we look at the other act, which is the Restrict Act, this does have cross-party support. And it has White House support, obviously, because it's a Democrat bill. Now, this is really quite staggering. So this has been put forward by Mark Warner.
He is the driving force behind Russiagate, by the way, and also getting social media companies like Facebook to do more sort of censorship right at the beginning after the 2016 election.
Right.
He was running point.
Okay, so Restrict stands for restricting the emergence of security threats that risk information and communications technology. As I say, bipartisan bill supported by the White House. It's very similar, Patrick, to the way that terrorism was used to bring the Patriot Act in. So some people are already calling this Patriot Act 2.
It's a massive Trojan horse. This is
yes,
using TikTok as the Trojan horse to reduce Chinese malign influence on children. This is how they're selling this bill, Mike.
Right. So look, TikTok isn't mentioned in the bill. What the bill mentions is desktop applications, mobile applications, gaming applications, payment applications, web-based applications, everything connected to the internet that serves anything greater than 1 million users per year. So that even a medium-sized website is going to be doing that, right? So this has huge scope, but the biggest part of it is that it actually enables the potential for the US equivalent of the Great Firewall of China. But what it additionally does is it effectively bans the use of virtual private networks. Now, in China, if you want to get past the Great Firewall of China, you run up a VPN, and the Chinese government doesn't seem to worry too much about people using VPNs, but the US government is going to legislate against the use of VPNs effectively here. So if we, for example, put that back on screen for a second, please, Stephanie, thank you. If we look at what it says, no person may cause or aid, abet, counsel, command, induce, procure, permit, or approve the doing of any act prohibited by or the omission of any act required by any regulation, order, direction, mitigation measure, prohibition, or other authorization or directive issued under this act. So in other words, if they ban a website, let's say RT, for example, if they ban a website in the United States, and then you decide to subvert or work around that ban by using a VPN, you would be in breach of this legislation.
Potentially.
Potentially, yes. Now, in the mainstream press in the United States, they're saying that the purpose of this legislation is to go after the platforms and not to go after individuals, but there's nothing in the legislation which says that. So that may be what they say publicly at this stage, but there's nothing that prohibits them. The penalties for breach of this are $1 million fines, imprisonment, the seizing of property. So for example, if you own a server farm and you're running VPN servers and your VPN service is allowing people to get around this legislation, the US government is attempting to take the powers to take your property away from you, remove those servers from the data center, you never see them again. It's quite incredible.
It is, and I might add, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, they have a great firewall for information, and people routinely use VPNs to bypass that. It's seen as just standard practice for the average citizen. But this is particularly relevant because the UK government banned RT.com, didn't they, under the ministership of Liz Truss, I believe,
right,
before she was promoted to prime minister for 40-something days. And so if you use a VPN in that hypothetical situation, Mike, to bypass the Great Firewall of Britain, to access RT.com, then you would be in breach of this type of legislation.
Right.
And as we're going to show, there's a lot of language now to normalize and streamline this type of legislation in the EU, in the UK, and in North America. So, and across the Five Eyes countries. So this isn't just an isolated issue. It has the potential to go across all of these G7 countries.
So, you know, in the UK, we're using child sexual abuse and child exploitation as the excuse for this legislation. In the United States, perhaps there's a little bit more honesty. It's China, and we don't like China, so we're going after them. In the EU, it's back to the child sexual abuse. So this is the EU's equivalent legislation here. Just one. There's a number of bills in the EU. So my point here is this is collaboration across multiple countries, G7 countries in particular, to bring in similar types of, if not identical, policies. And therefore, you've got to say, ask where's this policy coming from? Because it's not a national policy, it's an international policy.
And when they say privacy enhancing, you remember what you showed before?
Yes.
They were specific. They said privacy of data that we manage.
Right.
State, not your individual privacy. So this is really deceptive, the language. You need to pay attention to that slight turn of phrase by the government.
Yes. Okay, so let's move on to this tweet from the New York Times then.
So here, prime ministers of 8 European countries, Mike, read carefully, European countries, you think that's EU, don't you? We'll go on to that in a minute. 8 European countries signed an open letter asking major social media companies to take more aggressive steps to halt the spread of misinformation designed to weaken our support to Ukraine amid Russia's war of aggression. So you see where this is heading, don't you? The slippery slope continues here. Let's take a look at this open letter to big social media tech. Love the translation. Thank you very much, dear CEOs and big tech. So it goes on, but I'm going to look at a specific part of this. I think a couple of things we need to pay attention to. Look at this. Foreign information manipulation and interference, including disinformation, is being deployed to destabilize our countries, weaken our democracies, to derail Moldova and Ukraine's accession to the European Union. There we are. And to weaken our support to Ukraine amid Russia's war of aggression. So you see what's going on here, Mike. I don't know if this is kind of obvious by now already. And here's the interesting bit. Big tech companies should be vigilant and resist being used as a means of advancing such goals. They should take steps to ensure that their platforms are not being used to spread propaganda or disinformation that promotes war, justifies war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other forms of violence. So, of course, they're trying to point all of this at Russia. But actually, if we were to enforce this by the letter, Mike, it would be a much wider remit, wouldn't it?
Well, isn't it incredible that they're accusing whom of pushing disinformation that promotes war? The only organizations or institutions that are pushing disinformation to promote war are our own governments at this and the mainstream press, as far as I can see.
And we just showed you last week, remember the New York Times, rogue Ukrainian cell, the Germans and the Americans got together to come up with a cover story for the Nord Stream investigation that's not happening. So, and we'll go on here. Let's just move on to the next item here on this. But look at this. So this is really interesting. A consistent and global approach, as you said, Mike,
Right.
a global approach to regulation. The self-regulation by big tech, threatened by fines, right? Probably by the EU, is needed to respond to all these issues. The global dominance of a limited number of players makes this need even more pressing. Limited number of players. They're talking about Silicon Valley now. This is a call to action because foreign information manipulation and interference, including disinformation campaigns, pose a threat to democracy, national security. So this is now being couched in the rules-based international order. These are as a hostile attack on democracy. So they're calling the threat of disinformation on Facebook, Twitter now, and this could be your opinion on any weighing in on Ukraine, for instance, a threat to all these things. And look at the signatories here. We have the Prime Minister of Moldova, not in the EU. We have the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, and of course at the end, Denis Shimal, the Prime Minister of Ukraine. So European countries, 8 European countries. So Ukraine is now part of Europe de facto. They're already talking about their accession already.
Right.
That's news to some people. So there we are.
And that brings us then on to Julian Assange.
Well, this idea that journalists need to be protected, this doesn't seem to apply in Britain to one of the most famous journalists who's still unfortunately incarcerated in Belmarsh prison here. And it's coming up, Mike, to the 3-year, I believe, 4-year anniversary.
Right.
April 2019, he was bundled out of the Ecuadorian embassy and put in Belmarsh prison, unconvicted, still there in a Category A prison here. And I just grabbed something that we put on Facebook yesterday. Julian Assange is still on remand in high security Belmarsh prison in the UK on a U.S. Justice Department extradition request on trumped up charges that would make the NKVD or the Stasi blush. As a political prisoner, and he is a political prisoner, he awaits his freedom at the whim of politicians. President Biden will visit Australia and Anthony Albanese in May. So Aussies need to get organized and make some serious noise. And so here's what the Australian Penny Wong, the Australian FM under Albanese, she's saying, not so fast. Things aren't looking good in terms of freeing Assange from the Australian side. She's come up with a whole list, a bevy of excuses as to why this is not going to be possible. So she's warning that there's limits to what diplomacy can achieve. Well, they haven't really done much in terms of diplomacy, so it seems to be self-limiting from there. But here, look at this. The interesting stuff, everyone, is coming from America. So you have a potential bipartisan, the same bipartisan coalition that was pushing back against U.S. troops in Syria is now being activated to drop charges against Assange. This is extremely interesting. This is led by squad member Rashida Tlaib here, a Democrat. Congressional effort to end Assange prosecution is now underway. Signatures are being gathered to give to the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, that's Biden's head of the DOJ, to basically kill the extradition drive. So this is now happening, and this is interesting. I think there's some progress here. But all this comes amid an incredible revelation in the last 24 hours. This is unbelievable. Spanish company provide the CIA with information leading to Assange's arrest. We speculated about this before. Now, apparently, we have the evidence. Emails from the owner of the security firm UC Global was working with the CIA, revealed that he sold the data about WikiLeaks founders' legal defense strategy to an intelligence agency. Well, we know which one it is. The US government quickly sent a warrant to the UK to foil the escape plan. Here it is. Ecuador's President Lenin Moreno at the time ordered staff to work with Assange's Spanish lawyers to develop a plan to get Assange out of the embassy, grant him Ecuadorian nationality, and provide a diplomatic passport. The plan was set weeks before Rami Vallejo's meeting and was only known to 6 people. And now we find out known to the CIA. So here we go. When UC Global's cameras recorded the meeting, so they installed cameras in the embassy here, recorded the meeting by Assange. This was Stella Morris, now his wife Stella Assange, Ecuadorian consul Fidel Narvaez, and Rami Vallejo, who was the head, I believe, of the Ecuadorian security services. And it learned that the getaway would happen in 4 days. So this was December 25th of the year in which they're talking about there. I believe that is 2017, if I'm not mistaken, or late 2016 possibly. But Assange would leave in one of the ambassador's diplomatic cars and travel through the Eurotunnel to Switzerland or another destination in continental Europe here. And here's the message here. It's very late. This is from UC Global. Because the file is so big, I put the file in a shared Dropbox cloud storage data service. Someone with experience in audio can work out the audio. So he says the audio is muffled and so forth. And we'll go on here. Morales dispatched the data in the early hours of the morning to his American friends, and with immediate impact. The United States quickly sent an arrest warrant for Assange to the United Kingdom, so the escape plan had been aborted. So that was all happening.
And then he continued his time he continued to stay in the embassy for another year or 2 years, was it, after that?
Yeah, 2 years.
Yes.
2 years. So this was 2 years before he was bundled out of the Ecuadorian embassy, Mike. So, I mean, pretty incredible. Yeah, so 2 years, April 2019, he was bundled out.
Yes.
So, so that shows you, so this whole series of events was triggered by the CIA spying on Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy. So they managed to work with this Spanish security firm from southwestern Spain, UC Global, and this is how this all happened. This is an incredible story. So this is a pretty big revelation on the Assange case. So we hope that there's going to be some movement on the U.S. side. It certainly looks like there's a little bit of, it's going to become a wedge issue potentially for the election. In other words, if Trump says he's going to pardon Assange, that creates a huge advantage to Republicans in the run-up to the 2024 election. It's going to make Democrats look bad that they didn't stand up for civil liberties, for the free press, and so forth.
Okay, well, speaking of Donald Trump, let's just mention him briefly because he's now been indicted.
This is, well, the first time in history a sitting president or former president has been indicted here. Donald Trump is indicted by a Manhattan grand jury on more than 30 counts related to business fraud or the misfiling of business expenses, to be more accurate here. So this happened yesterday amid speculation that it might not happen. They thought it might be dropped. So this is not a federal court. This same case was thrown out of the federal court. The Southern District of New York looked at this and they said that there was nothing there worth prosecuting. It was a misdemeanor at best, but now this is allegedly a George Soros-funded district attorney here who campaigned on the fact that he would get Trump if elected, and here he goes. So this is a local court with a local police station, so Trump would have to do the perp walk in there. And so he's going to have his own photographers if that's the case. And I'm telling you right now, it's not likely they're going to be able to pull this off easy. The Secret Service cannot surrender custody or protection of the president to anyone. So they'd have to clear out the whole jail, the whole police department, and the whole block in order to do this. I just logistically don't see how this is going to be possible. So, you know, the other thing they're going to do on this is possibly negotiate a Zoom call for the indictment, so they could do this remotely. So Trump has said he plans to go in and surrender himself. That's what sources tell the mainstream media there. Whether that happens or not, anyone's guess. The point is, this could drag out for years. This could drag out for years. So why is this being done politically? To keep him off the ballot in certain states, potentially where this might, is this an ongoing case, might disqualify him possibly in a couple of states. This will not be able to keep him from running for president. But I'm telling you this now guarantees that Donald Trump is the front runner on the Republican ticket. They've made him into a martyr. And in terms of street cred and bona fides, he's now separated himself from Ron DeSantis and all the rhinos. His base is going to be fired up, and he can point to this and say, this validates everything I told you about the deep state, everything I told you about the corruption of the Biden administration, the DOJ. It's all there. So it basically validates all of the things that Trump and the mainstream media would say that it was a conspiracy theory. There is no deep state. There is no conspiracy to keep Donald Trump from. Of course there is, and here it is. So, and here's the interesting part. Ron DeSantis here said he will not cooperate with the federal government to extradite Trump if asked to the state of New York. So that's an interesting development. So Ron DeSantis is the presumed challenger to Trump in the polls as the sort of number 2 possibility in the Republican primaries. And he's supporting Trump in principle. And I think this is a good move for DeSantis. It's obviously good for Trump, generally good for the Republican Party that they have some solidarity on this issue, because this could be a Democrat in the same position. If you allow the system to use lawfare, Brazilian-style lawfare, which is what's happening in the U.S. now. And it doesn't matter what party is being targeted. This is
Right.
This is third world stuff.
Well, indeed it is. Vanessa, we've covered quite a lot so far. Welcome to the program. Any thoughts briefly before we move on to Israel and Syria?
No, I'm just wondering which summit is going to hold Biden and the United States accountable for flaunting democracy in Syria and annexing, invading, funding terrorists and arming them in Syria when he's talking about Russia and Ukraine.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, let's move on to another attack. I mean, it's another week, so of course there's another attack on Syria by Israel, and this continues to happen without any condemnation or criticism or comment, even from the mainstream press or any politician, really.
Yeah, definitely. I checked this morning. There's absolutely nothing in the mainstream press, nothing in the BBC. And nothing in American press. There's one article in the Times of Israel, which we'll show at the end. And this actually is the second consecutive attack by Israel on the last 2 days. Nobody was expecting it because we had an attack around 1 a.m. The day before. And then midnight last night, the sound was incredible here because they targeted an air defense base about 3 kilometers away from here.
Okay,
I don't know if you can put the sound up on the video, Mike.
Yes, we'll play the video with the sound. So let's have a look at this. So,
I mean, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, what people don't understand is that these missiles, winged missiles, pass overhead at very low altitude. So the sound that you heard on that video and then the explosion, what you tend to do is to hear the explosion because the first missile usually hits before the air defense starts to come into action. And so the sound is it's horrifying, actually. And of course, although Israel will claim they're targeting military zones, military bases, Iranian military servicemen, etc., of course, what happens, the fallout is usually in densely populated residential areas. So why are these attacks happening in the last 2 days? First of all, in the first attack 2 days ago, there were 2 air defense soldiers injured in the attack. And then last night, the midnight attack assassinated actually Milad Haidari, who's Iranian military advisor to the Syrians and himself an officer. So this was an actual assassination. It may have been that the day before they were trying to target him, they missed, and then they came back last night, because it is unusual to get two attacks straight after each other like that. But why is this happening? Well, in my opinion, there has been a sort of a fight going on between the Syrian allied resistance in the northeast, where the US is occupying oil, wheat, and agricultural resources and stealing them. Basically, 80% of Syrian oil is escorted out of Syria by US convoys and taken, mostly, the majority of it goes to the US bases in the northeast of Iraq. And so the Syrian allied resistance forces have been attacking the US bases in the northeast, which has led to apparently 6 US troops suffering traumatic brain injuries. 12 American force members have been injured in the strikes against them, and 2 what they call US contractors, which usually is a euphemism for CIA. 1 was killed, 1 was injured. Now, you'll remember that the traumatic brain injuries also happened when Iran retaliated for the assassination of Abu Mohammed Mohandes, the leader of the PMU in Iraq, and General Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian head of the IRGC. Now, Biden basically went publicly saying that he will hold off on more airstrikes in Syria for now, and basically saying that he doesn't want to escalate the conflict against Iran in Syria. But then, in my opinion, what did he do? He made a phone call to Israel, to Netanyahu, and he said, can you carry out the attacks on our behalf? And hence we had the retaliation against the Iranian military forces and Syrian Arab Army air defense. And as you said, the headlines are seriously missing in Western mainstream media, and the Times of Israel put out a lame report this morning. Syria accuses Israel of airstrikes in Damascus for the 2nd night in a row. Extraordinary. There is absolutely no international condemnation of this violation of Syrian airspace and violation of international law and the sovereignty of Syria. I mean, Syria is not at war officially with Israel, so Israel has absolutely no right to carry out these attacks. Of course, it will describe it as preemptive self-defense, which is kind of laughable, but there you go, it gets away with it.
Yeah, thoughts?
Well, I was saying, so Vanessa, you think that has anybody else opined about the possibility that Biden called Israel to insist that they take out an airstrike on their behalf, on Washington's behalf?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the first time it's happened, Pat. It happened a while back when basically there was another attack on one of the US bases. And if you remember, Israel then carried out an attack on a residential area in Damascus and a heritage site in Damascus, the Damascus Citadel, and another UNESCO heritage site in Sweden. So it was a clear message from Israel that was requested by the US to make the point, if you attack our US bases, we will attack civilian and residential areas in your capital city. And that was something that was confirmed by military sources here. So, yeah, I mean, it's, you know, the two work together. The fact that Israel uses Al Tanf base, the US base in the southeast, to launch missiles quite regularly, it's clear that they're working hand in glove militarily against Syria.
I think the traumatic brain injury report is interesting because the first time we ever heard that was after the attack by Iran on the U.S. bases in Iraq, as Vanessa said, in response to the double assassination of Soleimani and Mohandes. But this, and they didn't report it until after they had arrived in the German at Stuttgart, I believe, in the military hospital there. And all seemed a little bit strange. And there were some people that suspected it's possible that more people died in that attack, and that this somehow might be somewhat of a cover story. And so it's hard to tell. And certainly for the U.S. to report casualties or deaths in any kind of exchange like this in a place where they legally or militarily have no business actually being there, is problematic back in the U.S. Because if you said a dozen U.S. servicemen were killed in Syria on this attack, half the country would be saying, what are they doing there to begin with? But if it's only a few injuries, this can kind of slide under the radar in the media. So I'm just asking that question because both these occasions, very suspicious reporting.
Yes. Okay, let's move on to Ukraine then. And we'll begin with Zelensky in the Austrian parliament, because he went there to make a speech, as he usually does. He was thanking them for all the support that they've given. Of course, Austria is supposed to be neutral in this, so humanitarian aid is what he was thanking them for. But unfortunately, some MPs didn't like that very much, so they walked out while he was speaking and left behind these little placards behind. So the placards, this was the Freedom Party walked out, so the placards say space for neutrality or space for peace. So they're leaving the space for neutrality or leaving the space for peace. They were very much upset that the Austrian Parliament was hosting Zelensky and appearing to take a position on this.
Not physically hosting him, but this was
it was a virtual speech again. Yes.
Famous Zoom calls.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, that's really encouraging, actually. But are we right to say that? Can we say encouraging?
Don't know.
Does that mean we're supporting Russia?
But what else has it been up to? We mentioned. Remind me who this is.
Well, on screen here,
Yes.
this is a big event. This is really an important event. Orlando Bloom, the actor, made it to Kiev, and here's the photo op here with Zelensky. So yeah, there we are. The elves of Rivendell have arrived, and Legolas himself there to add additional support here. And I think what this really meant here is that, in fact, Zelensky was confirming the delivery of the elf army to finally turn the tide on this war that just keeps dragging on.
That's an interesting point you're making there, because of course there's a dark message here, because Russia are always referred to as the orcs.
Correct.
And so that actually is a pretty dark message that's being sent.
Well, it's also dark that Orlando Bloom was waxing on about Buddhist principles and Buddhist, because he himself is a practicing Buddhist. I believe he's SGI, Sakugai International, which is a lay Buddhist organization. And by the way, there's some wonderful people in this organization, and they are dedicated to world peace. So I find it problematic that he is making these statements about Buddhism. At the same time, he is almost encouraging, or seems to be encouraging, Zelensky. Orlando Bloom's not publicly saying peace negotiations. So the whole thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense. More inconsistency from the celebrities and from the political, the liberal left on Ukraine.
Okay, well, let's move on to Nord Stream then. And what's the latest?
Well, we a couple of days ago, UN Security Council voted will not probe the Nord Stream bombing. So no investigation. Obviously, the only members of the council that voted in favor of the resolution on this, well, this was the UN, initially the UN Security Council voted on Monday against a Russian effort to get an independent investigation into the Nord Stream terrorist attack, state-sponsored terrorist attack here. So this is the result of this is gridlock on this issue here with the UN Security Council, and China had some interesting things to say. Let's go to this video clip with captions in English here.
中方注意到，不少安理会成员在发言中谴责北溪管道遭破坏事件，一些成员也指出，调查要加快，信息要透明。这充分说明了全球跨国基础设施安全问题备受关注。 全面、公正、透明、独立的国际调查至关重要。美国热衷于对其他发展中国家搞所谓调查，但在这一对国际和平与安全构成严重威胁的事件上却遮遮掩掩，明显是搞双重标准。请问美国，你们害怕什么呢？中方期待相关调查工作尽快取得进展，早日让真相大白于天下，将肇事者绳之以法。
So I mean, this is a really important point, as she says, the US carrying out investigations in other countries, but when anything that potentially involves the US or UK, well, that's national security, can't talk about that.
blocking the investigation. So the U.S. is saying we didn't do it, but then they're impeding an independent investigation. So this is just going to feed into people's speculation that it was indeed the United States who either did or ordered, coordinated the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. So again, the party is telling us not to believe what we see with our own eyes here. So on the business of jets, Mike, so Poland, I believe, and another, is Estonia and Poland, I'm not mistaken, have committed MiGs,
Yes.
if I'm not mistaken there. So France basically wants to organize some Mirage jets for Zelensky, Mirage 2000s, and they're going to do a three-way deal. They're going to buy them back off the UAE. These are French jets that they fitted out the UAE Air Force back in the 80s with Mirage 2000s. They're getting old, but apparently they're still cutting edge enough for combat for Ukraine. They're also looking at Greece and Indonesia as well to put together a sort of an air force, if you will. It's a great report here, stunning report by the French journalist Freddie Ponton on this, who's done some really great research on this, Mike. So, but the problem is, it's the training that's already going on seems to be with ground crew. So we're asking the question, Freddie's asked this in this article, Mike, is it possible that they don't want to put Ukrainian pilots into the French Mirage jets? That maybe French pilots will be in the French Mirage jets, and it will be Ukrainian ground engineers, ground staff that they're training in.
Well, how can it be any different? How many platforms are they going to offer to Ukraine? So F-16s, Eurofighters, Mirage 2000s now, and the MiGs. Well, the only thing they've had training on before are the MiGs. So that's realistically the only thing that they can potentially fly. The other platforms is going to take them, as you've said before, months, if not years, to convert to those. And so this has got to be just another PR scheme, right? Unless, as you say, they're going to put their own pilots in there.
It is a PR scheme, and it's a good business deal because guess what? The UAE wants to order new Rafales to refit their whole Air Force. So good business for France. Get rid of the old, in with the new. Right. So they have inked a deal for Rafales with the UAE, France, so to be delivered before the end of the decade. So that's a done deal. I think they're going to buy quite a few of them, more than 50, I think, or around 50 or more. So this is interesting. The other thing that's interesting about this story is where will these jets be living if once they are transferred over to Ukraine? Will they be living in Ukraine? Or will they be living in Poland? That's the question.
Good question. If they do end up in Ukraine, I predict they will stay in a hangar.
Yes, so so there seems to be a plan to amass 80 planes from different countries in Poland. This is what this author of this article is speculating, and that will be the base for the new Ukrainian coalition air force to possibly enforce a no-fly zone or a, quote, safe zone, a humanitarian zone over Lviv and Western Ukraine.
Right.
So that's something to possibly look forward to. Anyway, keep an eye on this story. It's a very interesting one.
Okay, so let's have a look at this. Now, this is from December last year. This is blood money, pure and simple. A top aide to Ukraine's President Zelensky accuses BP of war profiteering with stake in Russian oil firm. So this idea that the oil companies have been making huge profits over the last lot of months as a result of Ukrainian blood is one that the Ukrainian government has been pushing for a little while. Why are we mentioning this now? Because a new article appeared in Politico saying Kiev says big oil should pay to rebuild Ukraine's shattered infrastructure. This is the Ukrainian energy minister. So let's have a look at what he says. He was giving Politico an interview. He said this: a lot of energy companies get enormous windfall profits due to the war. So we estimated that this at more than $200 billion. They get this money because we are fighting because of the war. I think it would be fair to share this money with Ukraine. I mean, to help us to restore, to rebuild the energy sector. So apparently we in the West will be continuing to pay extremely high energy prices because all the profits, anybody's thinking about windfall tax, you can forget that because that's all going to go to Ukraine if the Ukrainians have their way. But they've been pushing this narrative for quite a long time now.
So that Zelensky wants a windfall tax first, and then what's going to happen? The cost is going to be passed on to guess who? the European consumers.
Yes.
So that's interesting. And he's saying, Mike, that as the war is dragging on, so why not end the war? This is the part that's missing from this conversation. Why not end the war, and then we can sort of have all these problems solved? That doesn't seem to be happening. Nobody's talking about, nobody in Kiev, nobody in Washington, nobody in London or Brussels is talking about ceasefire or peace negotiations.
Indeed.
They just want to have more tax, more money, more arms. And where does it end?
Yes. Okay. If you like what the UK column does, you'd like to support us, please head over to community.ukcolumn.org. You're be very welcome to join us there, and your help very much appreciated. You pick something up at the UK Column shop, but please do share material you find from the ukcolumn.org website, but also ukcolumnextracts.co.uk and the other various platforms. Okay, let's move on to Africa. And Vanessa, we're beginning with a short video clip from Tulsi Gabbard here.
Yeah. She basically reappeared on Twitter after about 4 months absence, and with a Twitter thread that is basically the transcript of what she says in this video. So if we have a listen.
Okay.
Aloha, everyone. You haven't heard much from me lately. I've been gone for the last 4 months, serving on an active duty tour and deployment to Africa as a civil affairs officer. I was supporting a special forces mission to go after Al-Qaeda affiliated jihadists. Now, every single day, it was truly my honor to work with incredible patriots, experienced, focused warriors with an unwavering commitment to serve our country. We should never forget that, no matter the decisions that the politicians make or the careerists in the Pentagon make, it is our men and women in uniform who selflessly and quietly defend the safety, security, and freedom of our country every day. Now, I haven't posted much since I was gone because I was asked not to talk about my going overseas until my mission was complete. Al-Qaeda is very active where we were, and as someone who has a high profile, I would have been a prime target for the enemy, putting my life and the lives of my fellow service members and our mission in greater danger. Now I look forward to discussing the foreign and domestic issues and challenges that we're facing in our country.
Right.
Now, why is this interesting? Because here is Tulsi Gabbard basically supporting the narrative that there is a need for greater US military presence in Africa to do what? To combat the terrorist threat in the majority of Africa now. And yet Gabbard really came to prominence because of her very strong stand on the Stop Arming Terrorists Act, prevent terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda or state sponsors like Saudi Arabia from receiving cash, weapons, or intelligence. And as she says there, the practice of spending taxpayer dollars to fund counterproductive regime change wars must end. So I find it very interesting that here she is. She doesn't mention the fact that Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda splinter groups that are in Africa are part of the larger complex of terrorism that was created and enabled, empowered by the United States and its allies, obviously in the UK and the EU, etc., since 9/11. So this is an article from RT at the same time in 2018. Gabbard's Stop Arming Terrorists Act, or HR 608, states that it would prohibit the use of United States government funds to provide assistance to Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, formerly ISIS, their supporters, and others. And she says, every American would be surprised to know that for years, our government has been providing both direct and indirect support to these armed militant groups who are working directly with or under the command of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, all in their effort and fight to overthrow the Syrian government. So what has suddenly changed? Is Al-Qaeda no longer being funded by the United States? Is Al-Qaeda in Africa not important? If you look at the location of both ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So you have Saudi Arabia, Yemen. Yemen, we know we have Al-Qaeda, Arab Peninsula, that were largely defeated by Ansarullah prior to the 2015 aggression by Saudi Arabia. Now, of course, it's being re-empowered by the United States and Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel in Yemen. Saudi Arabia, the primary funders of ISIS in Syria, in the circle above. Many of those terrorists came in to Syria from Libya and have been percolated back out again from Syria back to Libya. In Egypt and the Sinai, we know that there are various splinter groups, again under the control both of Israeli intelligence agencies, US and UK intelligence agencies. We know that those terrorists can very easily get into the Central African Republic and into the other areas of Africa. So why is none of this context being presented by Tulsi Gabbard in her little sort of Twitter video there? Perhaps because the big threat, or the big perceived threat in Africa now, and we've talked previously about the front going eventually from Ukraine to Africa against Russia and China, is Russia's influence in the Central African Republic in particular through its, as it's described in the West, its mercenary group, the Wagner Group, which of course was also responsible for battling Western-sponsored and created terrorism inside Syria, and is now doing the same thing, from what we understand, in the Central African Republic and in many other areas. But of course, that is complete. I mean, that's sort of throw your hands up in the air horror for the United States, because what this means, and for the EU, because the EU has effectively failed, just as the US failed in Iraq to provide weapons for the groups that were genuinely fighting ISIS. France predominantly has failed to provide weapons to the Central African Republic to fight the terrorist groups described as rebels by the BBC and Amnesty, et cetera, again, very similar to the Syria situation. And here you have President Faustin Archange Touadera basically saying he has nothing to hide about the Russian support for the Central African Republic. And in fact, he goes on to say that the supply of weapons by Russia, 7,000 individual weapons, that Russia sent free of charge and legally. So he's basically saying this is nothing that is being done in secret. It was actually sanctioned by the UN. It was authorized by the UN. And the Russians sent instructors to train the Central African military on how to use the weapons that they supplied, that, as I mentioned before, France failed to supply. And it goes on to say, doesn't matter. So President Touadera attended a ceremony for the unveiling of the statue of FACA and Wagner private military contractors, and was escorted by a Wagner private military contractor. So what you're seeing really is both Russia and China, through a large degree soft power, through the establishment of infrastructure inside Africa in partnership with oil, uranium, resource companies there. But of course, what is the West and its media saying? The Wagner Group, while the EU is alarmed by Russian mercenaries in Central Africa, well, as I've mentioned, of course they're alarmed, because they see the rising influence of Russia and China. We know that the West has basically shrunk its military forces back into Mauritania in northwestern Africa, from where it intends to begin its fight against terror, in inverted commas. And here you have the BBC reporting that the European Union imposed sanctions on the Wagner Group, a Russian mercenary organization accused of committing human rights abuses in the CAR and elsewhere. The EU has said that it will no longer train CAR government soldiers because of their links to Wagner. In Africa, Wagner is involved in Libya, Sudan, Mozambique, and it looks likely to play a role in Mali, a former French colony, of course. So what are we actually seeing really here? We're seeing really the Syria blueprint. We're seeing military occupation, military bases established by the US in Africa, which are enabling the plundering of resources under the pretext of fighting terrorism that is effectively being produced by the US cartel and by NATO member states, either through, as I said, the percolation of terrorist groups that are already being used elsewhere, like Syria and Afghanistan, Libya, Egypt, and also by, for example, the Obama drone warfare program that is effectively having or had the effect of radicalizing and pushing people to join the extremist gangs that were, as I said, being globally weaponized by the United States. Then you have Russia being invited into many of the African states to actually fight against the US-sponsored terrorism. And you then have the US government and its allies and its aligned media criminalizing the Wagner Group and Russia for coming to the help of those African states in their battle against terrorism. Does that sound at all familiar? Sorry,
it absolutely does. It is a familiar pattern, and of course, one of the reasons that the EU in particular would be getting so excited about this is because what we're talking about. If we think back to that Africa map that you showed with all the red dots on it, that's the Sahel, where the majority of those red dots were. That is the Sahel. The EU considers that its southern neighborhood. That's its area of major diplomatic influence. And it gets very upset when anybody else encroaches on that territory.
Because it's the future breadbasket for Europe.
100%, yes.
Yeah, and remember that AFRICOM, the AFRICOM bases only really came in during Obama's administration, and that many of the weapons that are being siphoned out of Ukraine are ending up in the Sahel. Now, this is something that I watched this morning, and I just recommend people, if they want to know something about the history of AFRICOM and the US empire in Africa, the Empire Files has a series of interviews which historically do put a lot of context to the story. So I do recommend it.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Patrick.
Yeah, and just point out when AFRICOM was commissioned at the very end of the Bush presidency, and then, as Vanessa said, ramped up during the first term of Barack Obama. And a lot of their documents, some of the foundational documents, are no longer on their website. But we have bookmarked them, and previous people have written about this. The initial aim of AFRICOM was to, quote, evict Chinese influence from the continent of Africa. So that is one of the big things. And a quick question, Vanessa, Tulsi Gabbard did not say what country she was deployed in. There's quite a few possibilities: Burkina Faso, Somalia, Sudan. Do you have any guess?
I mean, she said that she deliberately didn't say which country for security reasons. But yes, you're right. It could be any single one of those.
I think it's interesting. This is kind of a mirror-like theme of the Cold War, where you have all these proxy wars going on, Soviet versus the U.S. in Angola, and during that period, and different people coming in to assist and fight these countries. So it's a kind of a new Cold War. That's interesting. Russia has something as well that the United States doesn't have, and I don't believe any other European or NATO country has, other than Turkey. Russia has a substantive contingent of Muslim members of its military, and that, I think, is one of the keys to their success in places like Syria. They have really good relations on the ground with local people, and this is something that the United States can't do. So in that sense, Russia has really good credibility in the countries that they go and they partner with. But the other thing is, how is this any different? All this talk about Wagner, BlackRock, Academy, XC. I mean, that's hundreds of billions of dollars worth of contracts from 2001 going forward. I mean, literally colonizing all these locations around the world. I mean, a massive global footprint.
Right.
So the criticism they have with Wagner, the Wagner Group is interesting, and there's an ICC angle to this, and the case against Vladimir Putin in the ICC, which we didn't cover properly today, which we can cover next week, but there's a stipulation in the ICC whereby if a country allows for the U.S. to, and we've reported on this at 21 Wire, to house U.S. troops on their soil, then it's likely they'll be passed over for any potential prosecution from the International Criminal Court. And think about that. The only people ever prosecuted before Vladimir Putin has broken the glass ceiling for equity, diversity, and inclusion as the first white man ever to be indicted by the International Criminal Court. Before that, it's all Africans. You walk into the lobby there, it's all Africans, 6 black Africans and Gaddafi. That's it. So you can avoid ICC prosecution by playing ball with the United States. Isn't that interesting? Because the U.S. is not even a signatory they haven't ratified the treaty for the ICC. They're not involved in it, but yet they control the ICC in so many different ways. It is a tool of the United States, and probably the British too.
And just to avoid the inevitable emails, Milosevic wasn't actually an ICC prosecution.
No, he wasn't. He was across the road in the Special International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, was not part of the ICC. I know I got slammed on Twitter when I said Putin was the first white man to be prosecuted, and I had to correct everybody one by one.
Yeah, okay, so let's move back to NATO then, and here's Jens Stoltenberg. I'm not going to bore everybody with what he actually said, but he was very excited this morning because the Turkish parliament has decided to ratify Finland's entry into NATO, and so Finland will be a member of NATO within the next week or so. That is hot off the presses this morning. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I just think it's a pretty bad day for Scandinavia.
Well, my question is, what did Turkey get in return for that? Because Erdogan is a transactional politician. He is like Trump. So they certainly must have gotten something or a promise of something. We'll find out soon enough.
Yes. Okay, Financial Times here, prepare for a multipolar currency world.
There's a lot more to say about this, and we're not going to get too deep into it this week, but perhaps next week we can go more in depth about this. The de-dollarization process is well underway, and there's some big announcements over the last couple of weeks to support this. And so this is the Financial Times, a really nice article here, prepare for a multi-polar currency world. So they're talking about the fact that the U.S. still dominates a lot of markets, especially debt markets. So, in terms of governments and liquidity, and dollar arbitrage, Mike, the dollar is still the go-to currency.
Yeah.
There's nothing that can replace it. The euro is probably in the second position on that. But the Chinese yuan is sort of surging in terms of trade. So this is interesting. The problem is China is kind of a closed economic system. So it doesn't have the sort of internationalization and the availability and the accessibility as the dollar does.
From a Western context, but of course from an Eastern context, as we see the development of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation, all these kind of organizations being set up, there's actually parallel systems being created for international transactions and so on. That's changing very, very fast.
Yeah, and the new Chinese SWIFT system, yes. It looks like the agreements between China and Brazil, that's been signed. Again, we didn't go into details on this week, but we can do that next week. So this is a trend, this is real, it's actually happening. We just wanted to make that point.
Now, King Charles has been in Germany. Of course, we're not going to bore anybody with that particular speech, but disbelief as Greek King Charles gives royal assent to new gene breeding technology. This comes on from our coverage of this last week, this new gene editing legislation.
That's right. So it's gotten royal assent here. And of course, this is Julian Rose, who himself is a pioneer in organic farming in the UK, Sir Julian Rose. He's written this fantastic story here, and he's basically calling this out as a kind of betrayal of especially organic farming. So look at the details. So he is the Green King, right? Charles is. Prince Charles had a green thumb, and he is the Green King. So here's what Julian Rose has to say. Here's the document here: Gene Technology Precision Breeding Act 2023. And this is what Julian Rose has to say in terms of commentary. And mind you, Julian is an expert in this field. In one of the more shocking hypocrisies of this year so far, Charles III, King of England, considered to be a strong supporter of organic farming and environmental causes, has given his royal assent to a biotechnology innovation, which will provide an open book for UK firms to alter the genome of animals and plants so as to create novel engineered species and biotech foods. Foods, in quote. We say foods, and we use that term loosely here. In taking this step, Charles has committed an open act of betrayal of all bona fide farmers, particularly of organic farmers here. And he goes on, this piece of legislation will, for the time being, be unique to the UK, such as animals and plant biotech deformations are not allowed in the EU and many other countries. Isn't that interesting? Especially with Brexit just behind us. Very interesting indeed. And he goes on here, finally, a secondary deception relates to the marketing of such novel recombinant DNA experiments here. And he goes on, the UK government has stated that no separate definition will be given to gene technology engineered products. Therefore, no special labeling will be required. And that is, I think, the part that Julian Rose is most concerned about, is they're not making a distinction between these different types of GMO practices or normal breeding and, let's say, interfering with the genes and so forth. So what exactly are we looking at here? Is this more deregulation?
The government is, of course, the government wants to establish the UK as the biotech center of the world. That's what it's claiming that it wants to do. In this case, they're attempting to claim that this will be in order to replicate what could be done in nature, but to do it in a much shorter time scale. So, we would end up with a plant or an animal which could have been arrived at through selective breeding, but that would have taken generation after generation after generation. This, of course, is untrue. They claim that this is not genetic engineering because although you're allowed to place genetic segments into the genome of the plant that you're messing with from an external source, from another organism, that genetic sequence has to be removed again before that so it can be used in order to create a genetic change in the organism, but that particular sequence has to be removed again at the end, and therefore it's not genetic engineering. But as Julian Rose says here, they aren't distinguishing the terms when it comes to marketing. And so you don't know what you're going to get. And my question, Patrick, is because if we look at the way farmers are being discouraged from farming, they're being encouraged to rewild, they're being paid to take arable land out of production. We've got what's going on in Netherlands at the moment with the farmers there, and in Ireland having to reduce the numbers of farm animals and so on. My question is this about creating crops or animals which can be grown in factories, literal factories, rather than in soil?
Lab factories, yes. Bugs, lab-grown meat, and so forth. So yeah, I think you're right, and that brings us on to the other side of this story here in the United States. This is from Thomas Renz's blog here, republished by Naomi Wolf's Daily Clout. Missouri House testimony, biotech admits Gates GMO factory food, as you're talking about, lab-grown food, is a gene therapy. In other words, it does change the genetic structure. Biotech lobbyists in Missouri oppose HB 1169 gene therapy disclosure and informed consent bill. They admit that GMO food, like the type Bill Gates is pushing to manufacture in these labs, factories, will alter your genetics here. And they go on. So the bill would require disclosure of any product that would produce impacts on the human body similar to gene therapy drugs, as well as requiring informed consent disclosure to include all risks and benefits, including adverse events of special interest. So there's people obviously opposing this disclosure bill. The industry is, and they're saying, well, it is dangerous. So that's basically what they're saying in the United States. So this is going on now on both sides of the Atlantic here, and in Europe. There's still some pushback on the GMO front on some of these issues, but for how long? That's the question.
Okay, let's bring Lieutenant Colonel Tobias Elwood on screen. Here he is, just to remind everybody what he looks like. Of course, he was pushing for all kinds of things, including vaccination certificates during COVID. But we put him on screen here because, of course, he's an MP, but he's also a reservist for 77th Brigade. Now, we have an article still on the front page of the UK Column website at the moment by Philip Ridley called 77th Brigade and the Parliamentary Conflict of Interest. I recommend that article to everyone. But Philip Ridley has put in a Freedom of Information request to the Ministry of Defence about Tobias Elwood. Let's just have a look at the text of that. He said to them, or he asked them, in light of Lieutenant Colonel the Right Honourable Tobias Elwood, VR MP, being an MP and chairing the Defence Select Committee, and with relevance to the House of Commons Disqualification Act 1975, I wish to ask whether you hold any records of dates that he was called up for active service whilst serving in Parliament. So as I say, he's a reservist in 77th Brigade, and the question here is, has he been called up for active service while he's been an MP? Whereas the 1975 Act would not cause active service of a reservist to become disqualified, I believe that it is in the public interest to know whether he has been or is called up for active service, in particular with 77th Brigade. If he has been called up, please provide any publicly available information about the details of the deployment. So I can't imagine what the answer would have been, but let's bring it on screen. This is what the Ministry of Defence said. The information you've requested falls entirely within the scope of the absolute exemption provided for by Section 40 (personal information) of the Freedom of Information Act. I can confirm that the Department holds the information you've asked for, but in this case we will not be providing it to you as it is exempt from disclosure. We are not obliged under Section 40 (2) of the Act to provide information that is the personal information of another person if releasing would contravene any of the provisions of the Data Protection Act 1998. In this instance, we believe that the release of this information would contravene the first data protection principle, and therefore 40 (2) is engaged. The terms of this exemption in the Freedom of Information Act means we do not have to consider whether or not it would be in the public interest for you to have the information. Now, I have a massive interest with a massive problem with this position, and this has to be challenged. And I'm going to say, I know that Philip Ridley is challenging this, but everybody that's watching must challenge this as well. This is unbelievably disingenuous of the Ministry of Defence to invoke the Data Protection Act under these circumstances. It has nothing to do with personal information of Tobias Elwood. Tobias Elwood has taken 2 oaths of office, one to Parliament, one to the Crown, and therefore he is acting as a servant of the public. And we need to know how he has been deployed. This is not something that is happening in his personal life. This is something which is happening in his public life. And therefore, any personal consideration of the Data Protection Act should not apply. Now, I'm just going to remind everybody, for those of you that have been watching the UK Column long enough to remember this, but back in 2013, I think it was, Rory Stewart MP went to the Bilderberg Group and he was challenged by a constituent. Let's just bring him on screen. Florence of Arabia, as he's otherwise known, he was challenged by a constituent to explain whether he went to the Bilderberg Group in a personal capacity or as a public servant, and he refused to answer as a sitting MP at the time. Now, of course, it wasn't a Freedom of Information request, and so it can't be taken any further, but nonetheless, there is a principle here about whether a public servant, when they act as a public servant, or whether they are doing something outside of their normal job while they're a public servant, whether they are entitled to keep that secret, because that then allows for all kinds of corruption and all kinds of hiding of conflicts of interest. Tobias Elwood needs to come clean on this issue, and I think everybody should be getting motivated.
This is an interesting issue, Mike. Do you remember the Integrity Initiative leaks?
Yes.
Do you remember there was a section in the Integrity Initiative leaks about the 77th Brigade? And one only has to wonder, in this particular case with Tobias Elwood, is the thing that needs protecting Tobias Elwood, or the way that 77th Brigade is actually working, because it is into a kind of a gray area, isn't it? There are people who volunteer also to work in the upper echelons of the 77th Brigade.
Right.
So this is how they recruit people in normal walks of life, be they lawyers, bankers, maybe politicians, so they could be working for 77th Brigade without, quote, working for 77th Brigade. That's an important distinction, but nonetheless, a conflict of interest that's basically latent in this arrangement. The same with the NAFO Troll Army, which NATO has, the 100,000 strong NAFO Troll Army that includes some very high-profile people in the upper echelons of NAFO, including former Congressman Adam Kinzinger, who ran point on the impeachment hearings and recently on the January 6th committee, who's left Congress now, who's now a private citizen and working for CNN as a journalist. So he is self-identified as a NAFO fellow or fella. I think the more I look at this, I think that NAFO is based on the 77th Brigade model. I really do. It's just a lot bigger and more internationalized. But,
so as a final comment on this then, so the Ministry of Defence said they hold the information. If that information was that he had not been deployed on active service while he has been an MP, I think they would have said no, but perhaps not. But anyway, we need to keep the pressure on this one.
It's all in the denial, isn't it?
It is indeed. Okay, let's just mention Virgin Orbit, because Virgin Orbit, of course, attempted to launch a satellite into orbit a few months ago. It failed. This was to be the first satellite launched into orbit from UK soil forever, actually. The British government absolutely bought into this and were promoting this extremely hard at the time. Now, Virgin Orbit has now said that they're laying off 85% of their staff after one failed launch, and they're going to cease operations. They couldn't raise the money and so on. But I just wanted to have a brief laugh at this, because if we remember about how engaged the Grant Shapps and the British government were at the time, so this was Grant Shapps tweeting out that the UK government is delighted to be backing the first ever satellite launch from European soil, actually from UK soil, liftoff scheduled for Monday at Spaceport Cornwall, Newquay. The thing about it was, Patrick, that Grant Shapps put that photograph on there, but that was a fake photo.
Oh.
Because this is what the photo actually looked like.
Oh. The original had Boris?
The original had Boris in it, and he got rid of Boris, but...
Are you serious?
I'm totally serious.
They used that?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. So Grant Shapps absolutely behind Virgin Orbit, except when he wasn't, because when they needed the money, there was no money to be had, and so Virgin Orbit is effectively gone. So there you go. Anyway, a bit of sad news to end.
Yeah, so we wanted to, some people might be aware, Greg Sharkey, he founded an event series called Imperialism on Trial. He's from Derry in Northern Ireland, and he sadly passed away, I believe, a couple of weeks ago in Chamonix in France. And his funeral service was on Monday in Derry, and very sad. He had a lot of supporters. He's a real asset to the anti-war movement, I would say. Brought a lot of people together, staged some fantastic events. He was a real warrior, an absolute warrior, and left behind, I think, made a big impact. He was a cab driver by trade in Derry, but he worked really hard during his extracurricular hours to organize so many great events, not just for Imperialism on Trial, but also opposing the lockdowns and COVID policies and questioning the vaccine mandates at a time when it was quite tense in Northern Ireland on that issue, because Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland had vaccine passport policies for a while there. So, I wanted to point people to this. The only interview, I think, one of the only ones that Greg gave, I did with him over the summer, and he's talking about his life and his history and the music industry and how the politics of music and the artists change right up to till now with the vaccine issue. And it's a tremendous interview. He's very deferential, very humble in this interview, and really you can get an idea of Greg, I think, from this. We've got this posted at the top of our website here, but he'll be missed by many, very popular, and a real visible member of his community down there, over there in Derry.
Okay, well, look, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thank you very much for that, Patrick. Thank you, Vanessa, for joining us. We'll be back in a couple of minutes for a little bit of extra, and hope to see everybody there. If you're not a UK Column member, then we'll see you on Monday at 1 p.m. as usual. Have a great weekend. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.